Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Warren. I'm the Curator of American History in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division here at the library. And it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, a real scholar in the field, Mr. Peter J. Aschenbrenner. Mr. Aschenbrenner received his JD from the School of Law, University of California at Berkeley in 1971. He served for 16 years as a judge in Alaska during his 39 years of practicing law in that state. He's recently published British and American Foundings of Parliamentary Science, 1774 to 1801, which you can buy on Amazon. I found that out today. He regularly contributes to Public Law, which is an academic legal journal, and he writes about decisions of the Supreme Court. Mr. Aschenbrenner is speaking today on Thomas Jefferson's authorship of a Manual of Parliamentary Practice for use of the Senate of the United States, the first American book on parliamentary procedure published. In fact, we have Mr. Jefferson's actual copy, his annotated copy, on the table over there if you'd like to take a look after the talk is over. Sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Warren. All right. There's a book that I'm going to write that covers parliamentary science from 1801 to 1890. It has a very sad ending. The writers on the subject of parliamentary practice and procedure, one you would have heard of, General Martin Roberts Rules of Order, and Luther Stearns Cushing, who worked in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, one of the figures is Speaker T.B. Reed, and we'll get to events surrounding his introduction of the Reed Rules in 1890. However, before you have any concerns about anything negative I might say about Speaker Reed, he is responsible for the building that we're in, so maybe it all kind of evened out. We're going to see a lot of evening out here. So our subject today is the manual. What I've done is I've reproduced a few pages at the beginning, and I've scratched, here is a newcomer, it's a, take your handout. So what I've done is I've scratched 3 places that I'll direct your attention to. Of course, it's yours to take. And one of the really unusual, in fact, this is the first book ever composed by a writer on parliamentary practice and procedure that was written around a set of rules, and these were called Rules for Conducting Business in the Senate, first edition 1790, and there's another edition 1798. By the time Jefferson was writing and finishing his book in November 1800, there were 28 rules. I've kind of skipped over some obvious things. I'll back up here. He ran for president in 1796, came in second. That made him vice president, and made him the presiding officer of the Senate. He was presiding officer of the Senate for 4 years. He'd already been working in the area of parliamentary practice and procedure, taking notes in what he called his pocketbook, which was not published until 1987. Had a spectacular scholar as its editor and writer of the critical apparatus, William Howell of Princeton, who was also the most distinguished scholar of British Aristotelian writers, and there's a connection there. Don't have time for it, but that's the connection. He composed his manual around a set of procedural rules. This is something Hatzel wasn't able to do. Hatzel's name will come up in a bit. Hatzel was the key writer in the area of parliamentary practice and procedure in Great Britain and then the United Kingdom, and when he finished the last of his 13 discrete editions of the 4 volumes in 1818, it topped out at 402,000 words. So Hatzel had composed real doorstops, and if you look over, well, if you've got it in your hands, what you have in your hand, Jefferson composed a volume that you could take into a parliamentary body and look at and refer to while politics was going on. So I've selected pages, and so the first note that I've made in your handout is, if you look, you'll see that you're directed to sort of scribble number 1, and that is section 2. Jefferson has a little code, and the code is that if it's in italics, it's U.S., and if it's in, at this particular stage, if it's in Parliament, is in the Roman letters. You have that notation at the end of the preface. Okay, so this is what you would expect a manual of U.S. parliamentary procedure to begin with. You would expect to begin with the Constitution, because the Constitution gives each House of Congress the power to write its own procedure. So that's section 2 is where you would expect it to begin. Now you would want to flip back to section 1 and see, well, what the heck is section 1 all about? Well, section 1 starts off with Mr. Onslow. Well, who is Mr. Onslow? Well, it turns out that Mr. Onslow is very, very important in another country across the Atlantic that had, within the last 25 years, had a small dust-up with the U.S. And here is Onslow buried in the Holy Trinity Church in Surrey. Okay. But Jefferson thinks that it's really important to start off with a manual about the procedure of the U.S. Senate by talking about Mr. Arthur Onslow. Chapter 2. So now we're on to Aschenbrenner. Jefferson thought that writing his manual, which is also a reflection of the work of the United States Senate, that with his manual and the rules composed by the Senate, this would be a contribution to European political culture. There you go. One might say that if one country gave up its commitment to parliamentary democracy, the other country would be able to carry on the tradition. Well, let's follow the trail of his citations. This is what you would have if you input this book, as I have, the 1801 edition. You input it into Word and start doing searches, and you have to kind of reconcile some of the citations. So it appears here that he has citations to the Constitution of the United States, which is what you would expect. He has citations to the Senate rules, but he also has 128 citations to John Hatzel. So 99 citations to the Constitution and the Senate rules as they existed as of November 1800, and 128 citations to John Hatzel. And this is a little plug for my website where I've got these editions of Hatzel downloaded. So, is Jefferson referring to the House of Commons in the Declaration of Independence? No, Declaration of Independence is not about the House of Commons. Is he an Anglophile, a Francophile, an Italophile? We know he loves everything Italian. So here we are in chapter 3. What did Jefferson give us in 1801? What did we lose in 1890? So let's go forward to 1890, January 29, 1890. This is the day that the classical tradition of parliamentary practice and procedure in the House of Representatives died. Here's the congressional record, and here is Speaker T.B. Reed of Maine himself. No booze, remember, he's responsible for this beautiful building and this beautiful room. A member of the minority party said, "I denounce the power of the Speaker as revolutionary," and that's all in the congressional record. But it turns out that this wasn't the only parliamentary body to kill the classical tradition of parliamentary procedure, and that was the Liberal Party, thanks to William Gladstone. However, William Gladstone had somebody who was really capable of crossing swords with him, and that is Stafford Northcote. And someday you're going to go, or you've been to Westminster, and you come in through the Great Hall and make a right turn and go up the corridor, and you get to the central lobby. And when you're looking in the House of Commons, which you can, in the chamber, you will see on the right Stafford Northcote and Gladstone on the left. So Stafford Northcote is our hero, and he says, the majority will be worked from some center outside. We will no longer feel that we are free agents. And if you want to take away one thing so far, there's more things to take away. This book is all about making free agents of everybody who is a member of a parliamentary assembly. So here's Stafford Northcote saying it's all going down the drain in 1882. Here he is holding his head. I don't think it's because he has a headache. But he says the majority ought to rule in the House, yes, but who will rule the majority? And then later on, there's a very competent journalist named Sidney Lowe who writes a very well-known book, The Governance of England, and he says the function of the House of Commons is no longer active because the decisions are being made outside the body. Okay. All right. So what we want to do is we want to start talking about what happens when people engage each other in the classical tradition of parliamentary discourse. And it turns out that in the 1780s and 1790s, there were three people who were working on this. You can call it a problem, a challenge. It was how to bring risk into the assembly, not how to drive risk out of the assembly. It's how to bring it in. And the solution was, as far as they were concerned, was what we would call word management. Back to Northcote and Lowe. They were afraid that risk and decision-making was being moved outside of the assembly. Now we turn to the manual that I reproduced for you. Members put new words into propositions. They voted words out. They swapped words in and out. And to manage words, you have to take a discrete number of ballots. And one of the examples we're going to talk about happened at the Federal Convention. There were 25 ballots that took Article 2, Section 1, which is the election of the president, from 61 words up to 385 words. Let's go over that again. 25 discrete ballots over 3 days to get the 61 words that were proposed by a committee up to the 385 words that we all know today. Okay, so here we are. We had, remember, we're back in 1787. I should sidebar. This is from Jackson's journal. He was the official secretary of the convention. When Jackson's journal was completed, Madison got access to a copy, and as soon as Jefferson got back from Paris, sorry about being light on the bio here, when he got back from Paris, he and Madison both shared a manuscript copy of Jackson's journal. So Jefferson has access to what's happening on the votes inside the convention, 89 days, 765 votes. Everybody in this room knows that Jackson's journal isn't a very good journal. Okay, we all understand that. It all got fleshed out by Max Farren in 1911, 1937. But this information would have been in there. This would have been accessible to Jefferson. So there are 25 votes over 3 days. You have 41 people. And this is what you have to do in order to basically code the data that's in each vote. Here, Virginia and North Carolina are voting yes for the top 3 vote getters in the presidential contest to go before the Senate. But we're here at a stage where the Senate is deciding the winner. And that's just an example of the coding. And even though it's very difficult to do this, I'm going to walk over here and hopefully the camera will follow me. Okay, word management. Word management is all about counting defectors. It doesn't make any difference whether your parliamentary assembly is divided up into slave owners or not slave owners, or redheads or not redheads, or Bo Sox fans or Yankees fans. It doesn't make any difference how you divide them, provided that defectors are being counted. In other words, we want to know whether people are defecting from our group. This is the highest number of defectors, 7. Okay, now this part, I'm going to ask you to just kind of use your imagination. If 7 people defected from your caucus on the, whatever the vote is, 13th or 14th vote, can you guess how many people are going to defect on the next ballot? Okay, hold that thought. Can you guess how many people are going to defect on the ballot after the ballot that you just guessed? Okay, so there's a certain amount of unknown information that you don't have at the time that you're risking. So here they went to 6 and they went down to 2 and then they went back up to 7. Now what do those unknowns count for in a parliamentary assembly? And this is the slide that explains what I just said. If you're at vote 3, you could guess at what's going to happen at vote 4. That's kind of unknown, but you can't guess at what's going to happen at vote 5, vote 6. Okay, here we go. This at first seems very anachronistic, but I'm going to back it up. That's Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's cat doesn't know if he's alive or dead, and the reason why we know that is because we can't look in the box and find out whether he's alive or dead, and if we do look in the box, we're suspicious that we've polluted our observation of Schrodinger's cat. Okay? So what we do is we model what happens in any time slice, that means any ballot, in a parliamentary assembly using this model. Okay? So what's on the right are the stochastic variables, what's on the left are systemic. Now systemic would be things like, should the Senate decide? Should the House decide? Should you flip a coin? How many votes should be taken? The number of top vote getters who go into the House or the Senate for the final runoff. Remember, we're still in Article 2, Section 1. Okay, so now we have brought unquantifiable and uncapturable risk into the work of the Parliamentary Assembly. That enhances the risk that lawmakers take in managing words. You are in the beating heart of the classical tradition of parliamentary practice and procedure. Okay? I described this to a colleague at the Reform Club on Pall Mall in London. He said, yes, it's like unleashing plutonium in a parliamentary assembly. All right, so now we have section 35, and we're going to go back to our little handout, and in the little handout you're going to find a rather badly scrawled number 3, and there are 2 places where Jefferson talks about friends of the paragraph. It's the page, kind of nod and say, yes, we're all there. Section 35, amendments. Now, if you've ever read Robert's Rules of Order, say a modern edition, and you start from the very beginning, you'll discover there's lots and lots of rules about motions. It turns out that if you read Robert's Rules about motion practice, which is all about the rules for people standing up and saying things about words they want in, out, and swap in a proposition, you will discover that this is the grandfather of Robert. Here we are in 1801. Robert doesn't get published until 1876, goes through multiple editions, wildly popular. And this is the grandfather of Robert's Rules of Order. And so if you ever see to yourself, gee, it's a little off-putting to open up Robert's Rules of Order and just to be reading all about motions and their supervening motions and hot dog motions and primary motions and secondary and not so important and tertiary motions, that's what this is all about. And the phrase that I pointed out to you is friends of the paragraph, bottom of this page, friends of the paragraph over here, top of that page. What does it mean to be a friend of the paragraph? Well, we'll back up a bit. John Hatzel became Clark Assistant in 1762. He published his first book. It was really a book about parliamentary practice and procedure in 1781, so it took him 19 years. Thomas Jefferson became president of the Senate, or presiding officer. It took him 4 years. Insert slide about building on the shoulders of giants. Okay. So here we are on the Philadelphia Convention, and it turns out the Philadelphia Convention adopted its own rules of procedure. Here's just sort of, they actually took them 2 days to do this. Here we go. And then here's the opening of the journal. It was published in 1819. And then now we have it's basically a pathway. What we've done is we've taken the data from the 25 votes, we've coded it, we put it into R, and then this is the QQ norm chart, the results. So you can say this is a pathway for the friend of the paragraph as coded in a modern program over 25 votes. Being a friend of the paragraph means that you can see where you're going with your like-minded colleagues in the assembly. So they were taking chances, but they thought that they were following a pathway. And this is the flip of that. Following the pathway is outside in. This is inside the competition between the systemic and the stochastic variables. Okay? Erwin Schrodinger's cat lives in there. Now, this is my argument. Regrettably, I didn't get this into the handout. Jefferson says at one point in his discussion of the passage of a bill through a parliamentary assembly, accident and management often prevent a successful rallying on the question. And the successful rallying is taken from a given caucus or faction's point of view. In other words, people who want the bill to pass. You can do this in the negative for the not wanting the bill to pass, so it doesn't make any difference. When he says accident and management, what he's talking about are systemic and stochastic variables. That's what he's saying. He's saying that if you bring risk of getting it wrong into the assembly, you have replicated the risk that the bill will fail once it becomes an act of Parliament, an act of Congress in the real world. And that's what people have been working on for about 25 years. Okay, here we go. Now, politicians are especially good at detecting patterns of behavior, and that, when you saw the QQ norm chart, that's what you were looking at. Their understanding of the lay of the land, you can say that they see architecturally things that we don't necessarily see, and that's what Jefferson is. He's, in his other life, one of his many other lives, he's a designer of space in and out of time. And I thought of a modern photo of Monticello, but I just think this sort of early 19th century rendition really fits the bill. So this is another Jeffersonian space. So this is my modeling accident and management. Now we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about Jefferson the person. I thought this would be a fun, we're trying to kind of cool down. The Library of Congress is so fond of this. This is Maclay's journal. He's a senator from Pennsylvania. And he wrote this very lively journal of what was happening in the Senate in this 2-year interval. And the Library of Congress thought this was so interesting, they actually have this on a web page itself. Jefferson is a slender man. I won't read the whole thing. His whole figure has a loose, shackling air. He had a rambling, vacant look and nothing of that firm, collected deportment, which I expected would dignify the presence of a secretary. This is obviously when he's Secretary of State. So why would you compose a book on parliamentary procedure? Well, I looked for gravity, Maclay says. I didn't find it. But a laxity of manner seemed shed about him. He spoke almost without ceasing, but even his discourse partook of his personal demeanor. It was lax and rambling, and yet he scattered information wherever he went. And some even brilliant sentiments sparkled from him, if he felt like it. You know, you guys need some brilliant sentiments? Hey, I got a few. In his own mind, Jefferson is always composing a motto for a temple, an architectural jest. This is one of my personal hobby horses. You're free to take it or leave it. So when Hadrian built the Pantheon, he thought it'd be really kind of a cool thing to take the entablature, the motto, from a temple that had been built 100 and something years before and put it on Hadrian's temple, because after all, you know, you don't want to say it's Hadrian's Pantheon. You make people figure out that it's, hey, you have to work for it. And of course, that's where we are with the inaugural address. So he picks up his book, that's the book over there, from the printer on Saturday, the last Saturday in February, and then on the first Wednesday in March in 1801, he's inaugurated as president. He has all these are really very profound words, and they're very moving. But when you get to the very bottom of this, he says, I'm contemplating transcendent objects. Well, how are we going to get to transcendent objects? Transcendent objects, for purposes of this talk, is peace and prosperity. Well, he says that's really a problem to see what these transcendent objects are. They're so transcendent that they are destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. So how do we get to these objects? Now, we're in the inaugural address that he was obviously composing at the time that the printer was finishing setting the type on his manual. So how do you know you're on the right path to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye if you can't see where you're going? Well, you need some other people with you in a parliamentary assembly. Those are the risks that you take in the classical tradition. So in this way, political society is serving as the mind of civil society, transforming the sphere in which inhabitants lived. And so we can say that system structures and institutions in political society are change agents. And small sidebar here, Edmund Burke, in criticizing the French Revolution, properly so, said that government is a contrivance of human wisdom to provide for the wants of the inhabitants of a nation. Okay, fine, but what happens when you have people who are contemplating transcendent objects by taking words out, putting words in, and swapping words in propositions in a parliamentary assembly? And the answer is, these are the felicities that are generated when people take risks in a parliamentary assembly, according to Thomas Jefferson in 1801. So, let's see. There we go. So, parliamentary competence enables lawmakers to take an aggressive posture when it comes to managing the want-get gap. And so by the time you have gone past the French Revolution, this is what concerns all politicians on either side of the Atlantic, which is if the inhabitants want something and they don't get it, there's likely to be destabilization or delegitimization of government structures, systems, and institutions. And Jefferson thought that the way that this gap was mediated was by keeping citizens in mind of the transcendent objects, which is what they would want, peace and prosperity, but having parliamentary assemblies that had the core parliamentary competence to achieve those results, even if that was going to take not just years, not just administrations, but generations in order to achieve it. And he said that when he said, the destinies of the American Republic are beyond the reach of mortal eye. Okay. So the an interrogatory that I would pose would be, would it be possible to recreate Jefferson's ideal of a parliamentary assembly? Well, in Philadelphia, it had 40 people, and they took 25 ballots. You really only need about 20 people, and I would say somewhere around maybe 10 ballots or something like that. Now, you would each have to bring your own wigs, but your frock coats would be optional. Perhaps they would be rented at the door. But in any event, it is possible to recreate the classical tradition of parliamentary procedure in a modern-day assembly with modern-day issues, provided that the understanding of word management is accepted as the core competence. Okay? I already gave you that joke. All right. And if somebody is really aggressive and wants to give Hamilton a run for the money, I think Jefferson the Musical, because after all, he's a man who understands space, he understands choreography, and he certainly understands posture. All right, thanks for listening. And we have plenty of time for questions. Please, fire away.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah. Can you describe a little bit more the comparison between what you consider to be classical parliamentary debate versus the kind of debate that we see on C-SPAN or public almost every day on the floor, let's say the floor of the House, or in a committee, or in a smaller committee, if you all have 40 members, and maybe there are 40-member committees that still are larger or smaller. I mean, what's the distinction? Other than you engage somebody in the deliberative process to try to find a resolution to a problem that is suitable to all and maybe will resolve the issue or problem.
Right. So the question is, what, if I may rephrase, if I don't get it right, you get a follow-up. What would Thomas Jefferson think of C-SPAN? Well, what he would say is that what people are talking about, there's A and B, then there's C and D and E and F. What people are talking about must be directed from outside. There must be somebody saying, this is the position that our political party wants you to take. This is what we want you to say on the floor. Whereas when you go to section 35 in the amendments and you read friends of the paragraph at the bottom of one page and the top of the other page, what people are saying is much more volatile, much more spontaneous, much riskier. And so people don't have the opportunity to rigidify their positions because there are so many ballots on words going out, words coming in, and words being swapped that they're taking much more risk. And so in fact, these studies have been done, I don't know about the US, but in Canada and in the UK, they've done extensive exit interviews with members of the House of Commons, obviously, in each country. And what they've discovered is people are just completely fried with their experience, particularly as backbenchers. And that is, they do not feel that they have the opportunity to participate in lawmaking. Because you can't have a career in a parliamentary body unless you obey the center, as Stafford Northcote says, which exists outside the assembly. Now, how did I do?
Not bad.
Okay.
So what precisely happened in 1890 and 1883 that caused the change?
Well, let's go with 1882 first. The Irish nationalists who were elected to Commons caused so many difficulties and slowed down the process of, particularly of getting the budget adopted.
That was for Irish as a rule.
Beg your pardon?
Was that for Irish as a rule?
Yes, of course, yes, which Gladstone, by the way, was in favor of. But Gladstone felt that he had to adopt not new standing orders, he just called it a new set of rules based on urgency. So it was really, from his point of view, let's try to be sympathetic, it was life or death for the House of Commons. If the House of Commons couldn't adopt a budget, then you couldn't run a country. In 1890, there is no doubt that there were dog in the manger practices by the minority party. Put too fine a point on it, these were the Democrats. And so they wanted to play games with the quorum rules and pretend not to be there to defeat a quorum. So Reed imposed a new structure at the spur of the moment. It just pops up in the middle of the congressional record. So yes, when you're talking, if we're being sympathetic, when you're talking about that level of obstruction in a parliamentary assembly, something's got to give. But they didn't have to kill the tradition of words in, words out, words being swapped. For example, as this gentleman pointed out, that could have been carried on in committee. Yes?
So your definition of classical parliamentary procedure, which it sounds like you're in favor of, right? How exactly does it work? Like, is it that any individual member can put any proposal before the body for a vote? Because that's not how I read Jefferson's manual, right? There's that front of the paragraph, and there's also about amendments and the embarrassment of third-degree amendments. But your example with the Constitutional Convention with all the ballots or whatever, that sounds like. So how would that parliamentary procedure really work? That anybody, we're going to decide what to have for dinner, and any one of us can put up any question, and we'll vote, and then another question can put up, and then we'll vote. Like, how is that parliamentary procedure? Like, what to really define what this classical thing is that you're seem to be praising?
Well, allow me to plead guilty to praising Thomas Jefferson. But there's an implicit question there that I think is really worth asking, which is, what if one were to revive the classical tradition just for the purpose of putting it on video and being able to say, okay, this is a modern interpretation of the classical tradition. This is how it would work. In other words, we don't want to just have people in wigs and frock coats and then it turns out that it doesn't work.
Well, what is
Go.
it? Because I don't see Jefferson as anybody can offer anything at any time. So what do you mean, like how do propositions get put before the body and with what restrictions in classic parliamentary procedure?
Okay. it's always a bit of a hurdle. I want to make sure that I give you everything you need. At the end of the 18th century, there was a procedure called Committee of the Whole House. And so when a bill had passed the first reading, and then the bill was going into the second reading, at some point, you would have a free-for-all where, yes, people could not, it wasn't just that everybody could talk more than once. And so that could go on for days. Not days in the sense, I mean, you would pick it up, you know, Saturday, Monday, Wednesday, something like that. But yes, there was a free-for-all, everybody can talk as much as they want. It was subordinated in a sort of a subset of the assembly called Committee of the Whole House. And that was in effect both in the House of Commons and in the Senate. Back to you. Go ahead. So yes, there was a free-for-all, but when you got into the more formal proceeding, what would happen is one person would make a motion, then that would have to be seconded, and then there could be discussion on that, but everybody in the assembly could only speak once. And so that provided a little bit of time constraint. You're always playing off word management against time management. Now, how did that work?
I guess from my looking at the history of the House of Representatives, right, and the use of the Committee of the Whole, like if we're going to talk about the Committee of the Whole and offering amendments, and like there's a gradual development there, right, over it's not, it wasn't like anybody can do anything until 1890, right, so there's other changes before 1890, and then obviously there's major changes, probably the most significant being in the 1970s.
Yes.
That's bringing us the House we see today with much more structured, but that's the 1970s, right, when we start restricting what can happen in the House. So I was looking at what, like for a precise definition of Jefferson's, but it sounds like you're just talking about like early, what we can see as early parliamentary procedures, smaller legislative bodies, as they're developing the institutions and figuring out what rules they're going to put in place. So
Yes.
we see sort of the origins of amendment trees in Jefferson's manual that develops in both House and Senate.
Yes, if
And still somebody's picking that bill to go to what bill they're going to take up.
Yes.
Like that's still a decision that's being made outside, as you said, right? Somebody outside is still going to get to say, this is the one we're going to take up. And then we're on that bill. Right? We've got germane restrictions in-house very early on, too.
Oh, okay. Let me try to say it this way. I'm not sure it's really an answer to your question. Jefferson is trying to explain the work of the United States Senate in such a way that if somebody at that time, the UK, read what the Senate was doing through Jefferson's filter, they would say, aha, this is a sister body to what we have at Westminster. Yeah. And yes, there's a certain bleaching out of sort of local irregularities or local differences that Jefferson is not that interested in. But you also have to remember that Jefferson has really arrived at the perfect time because there are only 28 rules. And so, for example, when the treaty settling the quasi-war with France comes up in the fall of 1800, the Senate says, oh ho, let's go out and write a couple of new rules of procedure for how we deal with ratifying treaties. Washington had brought this up in 1789. The Senate didn't want to write any rules on ratifying treaties until 1800. But where Jefferson has really put the Senate, it's the United States, but the same thing, put the Senate in the forefront of the development of parliamentary procedure is that the British had an extremely narrow but well-developed tradition of translating best practices into standing orders, but mostly in enclosures, turnpikes, and canal projects. So the British approach to use of parliamentary procedure was extremely narrow but very deep. The American approach was extremely broad. Okay, it's broad, it's going to be kind of thin, it's going to be kind of shallow, and we're not going to be able to cover all of the issues because, you know, we've got 200 years in which to do it. So Jefferson is both assisted by this very, very lean set of rules, which enables him to write a very short work, whereas you couldn't really write a work like this in the United Kingdom. And the proof of that is when Hatzel sets out to suggest new procedures in 1781, he writes 20 new proposals for standing orders. In his book in 1785 on financial practice, he proposes 40. Take a wild guess as to what William Pitt does with that. Nothing. He's not interested. Because Pitt just wants to rule commons. But if you, apologies if I descended way, way, way into the minutia. So there's something absolutely perfect for Jefferson about having a few rules that he can write a book around, but not so many rules as to just to sink his project out of sight. Thank you.
Would it be fair to say that according to your interpretation here, what Jefferson understood himself to be doing in creating the manual was analogous to writing a constitution?
No. But let me say something that's kind of interesting. If you want to see something that looks like the classical tradition, go into a nonprofit, I'm sure a lot of you have been on nonprofit boards, or go to a state commission, board, agency, and watch what happens when propositions come before those bodies. Keep in mind that in general, most nonprofits, a few social clubs are different, but most nonprofits don't have constitutions. Commissions don't have, state commissions don't have constitutions. So when you look at the beginning of Roberts, and he's starting with all these motions, he's starting with words in, words out, words being swapped. That's what he's talking about. He's not burdened by having a constitutional framework that he has to deal with. Jefferson has this absolutely natural way of writing a book about procedure that is being adopted by the Senate, but there's only one clause in the Constitution that is a critical clause for that, which authorizes that. In general, the Constitution provides a little bit of structure from time to time. And so, for example, and several of you who arrived early said, are you going to talk about impeachment? Here we go. The reason why Jefferson didn't talk very much about it was because there was a book written on impeachment that was published in 1796. He didn't have access to it in 1801. So that's my excuse. It's not really a very good excuse. But he did bring up impeachment in the 1812 revised edition. But the answer to the question is, if you just took the word constitution out of what your question was and just said, don't you need structure? The answer is yes. You need a lot of structure in order for a parliamentary assembly to work. And as this gentleman brought up, when you get to the place where you have a real dog in the manger obstruction, as you did in 1882 and 1890, the first impulse of any parliamentary body is to go get more systemic variables and to cut down on surprise, doubt, random behavior, because that's just obstruction. And that was a very understandable response to the situation.
How much of Jefferson's philosophy was a reflection of his discontent with parts of the Constitution, so he was going to be using the rules of order to protect the minority view, and thereby sort of indirectly try to achieve what he could not do directly in the drafting of the Constitution?
Okay, that's a huge question. Let me narrow it down to 1801. Remember that the 7th Congress came in and was overwhelmingly, it's hard to know what name to use, National Republicans, Republicans, Democrat Republicans, but they were Jefferson's party. So Jefferson had the advantage of being able to say, oh, I think that whatever Congress has in mind, I'm sure that they will come up with fine programs, and if they adopt something, that's great. If they don't adopt something, that's fine too. So there was a certain way in which whatever Jefferson's political philosophy had been in the past or might be in the future, he was able to talk programmatically. Let's expand the size of the United States and Louisiana Purchase. Let's build a national road to Ohio. He was able to talk like that, and from the point of view of moderns, we go, hey, wait, that time slice of Jefferson doesn't seem consistent with what he said before or what he said after. So the answer to your question is, if you want to talk about his political philosophy, you have to take the time slice. But the time slice in 1801 is one of optimism and unbridled confidence that Congress is going to do the right thing. Not always possible for us to get our heads around exactly how that's going to work out. But and the lady over here really put her finger on it when she said, yes, could the classical tradition work unless you had one of these moments of optimism where everybody, one political party controls everything and everybody seems in agreement on where they want to go. Mr. Warren is going to bring things to an end.
No, if there's any other questions. If not, I'd like to thank Mr. Aschenbrenner for a great lecture, very interesting, and thank you all for coming and asking some great questions. Whenever we talk about Jefferson, we always get very good questions. Again, a round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you.